Today we're digging into Karen Armstrong's incredible book, The Battle for God, to try and understand a force that, let's be honest, is still shaping our world in huge ways: religious fundamentalism.
When you hear the word fundamentalist, what comes to mind? Probably someone who's stuck in the past, right? Someone trying to drag us all back to some ancient pre-scientific age. It feels old, dusty. But what if that's completely wrong?
And this is the absolute core of Armstrong's whole argument. What she says is that fundamentalism isn't just old-time religion carrying on as usual. No, it's something new. It's a deeply modern reaction, born out of this really painful, often scary clash with the secular, rational world we've all built. It's not a relic, it's a revolt. So to really get this revolt, we first have to understand a key concept Armstrong uses. It's this ancient idea that we humans have always had two ways of thinking, two ways of finding truth: logos and mythos.
Okay, so what's the difference? Well, logos is all about reason, logic, science. It's the practical side of our brains that helps us build a rocket ship or figure out a budget. It's about what works and what's factually correct. Mythos, on the other hand, that's not about facts. It's about meaning. It's our myths, our art, our spirituality. It's what helps us make sense of life, deal with death, and find our place in the universe.
And for pretty much all of human history, these two were kept in balance. They each had their own job. You wouldn't use a myth to engineer a bridge, but you also wouldn't try to use an equation to comfort a grieving friend. They needed each other.
But then, around the 18th century, something changed. Science, logos, became so incredibly successful that the modern West started to believe it was the only way to find truth. Mythos? That was just dismissed as fantasy or superstition. And this left a huge hole in our culture, a spiritual void, what some people have called a God-shaped hole. And it's right inside that void that this battle for God really begins. So let's see how this actually played out. First up, our first case study, American Protestantism and the new kind of spiritual armor it had to forge for itself.
For about 200 years, traditional Christianity just took hit after hit from this new world of logos. First, you have the Enlightenment, which put human reason above divine revelation. Then came scholars who started analyzing the Bible like any other book, questioning who really wrote it. And then, of course, the big one, Darwin. His theory of evolution seemed to blow the creation story right out of the water. For a lot of believers, it felt like an all-out war was being declared on their faith.
So, how do you fight back? Well, in a world that only respects logos, they figured they had to turn their mythos into logos. They started insisting that the stories in the Bible weren't just spiritually meaningful, they were scientifically and historically perfect, literal, provable facts. You see what they're doing? They're trying to beat science at its own game by making their faith a kind of science, too.
And this quote from a major theologian at the time just says it all. You can feel the siege mentality. For him, this wasn't some friendly debate. This was a desperate fight for survival against a powerful enemy.
So, while some Protestants were busy making their faith scientific, a very similar sense of being under attack was happening within Judaism. But it led to a totally different kind of reaction.
Okay, so for centuries, many religious Jews believed they had to wait for the Messiah to bring them back to the Holy Land. But then, it happens. A Jewish state is created, but not by the Messiah. It's created by secular, practical, modern politicians. For some ultra-Orthodox communities, the Haredim, this was an absolute horror. It was seen as a blasphemy, a man-made creation that threatened the very soul of their faith. Their response wasn't to argue about science, it was to retreat and build a fortress around themselves. They created a complete counterculture, basically a society within a society, designed from the ground up to reject and revolt against the values of the modern secular world around them.
And you see this revolt in everything they do. In a country where military service is almost sacred, they fight for exemptions so their men can study the Torah instead. They create their own separate world with its own rules, challenging secular society at every turn. It can get so intense that they'll even attack people within their own community just for having a TV, seeing it as a portal for the corrupting influence of the modern world.
Okay, our final case study takes us to the Muslim world. And here, the clash with modernity was often much more sudden, much more violent, and the reaction was, in turn, much more revolutionary.
You see, in many Muslim countries, modernity didn't arrive as a set of ideas to be debated in a university. It arrived with colonial armies, with foreign bankers, with economic forces that just shattered traditional life almost overnight. It was a shock, and for many, a deep humiliation.
Just try to imagine the whiplash in a place like Egypt.
Farmers are suddenly ripped from their villages and forced into Western-style armies. Foreigners are running the economy. Huge new Western-style cities are built where local people feel like strangers in their own country. The world they knew was just gone, and it left behind this deep crisis of identity and spirit.
And it's out of that chaos that a new kind of movement is born. A school teacher, Hassan al-Banna, looked around and saw that political fixes weren't working because the people were spiritually broken. So he created the Muslim Brotherhood. Its goal wasn't just political, it was to heal this demoralized society by going back to the fundamentals of Islam.
So we've got Protestant Christians, ultra-Orthodox Jews, and pioneering Muslims. 3 very different faiths, right? From totally different parts of the world. And yet, what Armstrong shows us is that they are all actors in the exact same modern story.
Because when you look closely, you see the same patterns, the same psychological DNA in all of these movements. First, there's a real fear of being wiped out, a belief that the secular world literally wants to destroy them. That leads to this intense siege mentality, us versus them, good versus evil. And finally, in a complicated modern world full of gray areas, there's this powerful desire for absolute certainty, for black and white answers from religion.
And this is where things can get really dangerous. Remember logos and mythos? The great tragedy of fundamentalism is that it often takes mythos, the stories meant to give us spiritual meaning, and tries to force them into the world of logos, turning them into a literal, rigid political plan. And that's how a spiritual quest can morph into a harsh, intolerant, and sometimes violent ideology.
But what's really fascinating here is that it's not just a one-way street. Armstrong points out that militant fundamentalism and aggressive secularism can actually feed each other. They're locked in this toxic dance. The harder one side pushes, the more threatened the other side feels, and the harder it pushes back, creating this spiral of extremism.
So, is there a way out? Is this battle just going to go on forever? Well, for Armstrong, the solution isn't about one side finally winning. The only way out is to rediscover compassion, to actually try and see the fear and the humanity that's driving the other side. She says it's the only thing strong enough to break down the walls in our polarized world.
And that really leaves all of us with a central question of our time. These movements, in their own way, are struggling with a problem that affects every single one of us. In a world of logos, a world that has mastered science and reason, how do we also make room for mythos? How do we build lives that aren't just efficient and rational, but are also filled with deep, profound meaning? That, at the end of the day, is the battle we're all in.